Hello. Today we're going to look at an event from very early in American history, almost one of the first really significant moments of European contact with the New World, and one of those moments that shapes the rest of New World history, particularly for what we call Mesoamerica, which would be modern-day Mexico down to El Salvador and Honduras, and even further south into South America, right? The areas of the world that will become New Spain and part of Portugal and Brazil. And we're going to specifically address one big question, a question other historians have looked at before, your textbook looks at it, and it's a question we're going to look at again. And the question is this: how does Hernan Cortes, right, the conquistador, starting in 1519, conquer the Aztec Empire, right? How does Cortes conquer the Aztec Empire? And this is no small question. It's something that even the earliest observers, Hernan Cortes' own contemporaries, marveled at, because on the face of it, Hernan Cortes shows up with a few boats, about 500 men, all soldiers, horses, a few cannons, they have guns, they have steel, and he does this really great thing. And whether he really does it, they wrote it down as if it really happened. He makes his men burn the boats. They land on the eastern shore of Mexico in 1519, and he says, we're not leaving until we've conquered this land, until we've gained the treasure that I know is here. And he does this very symbolic thing of burning the boats. That level of hubris actually isn't surprising in these contact stories. But what is surprising, what is the first time this happens, is he pulls it off. Over the course of the next 3 years, by 1522, he has conquered one of the largest and most sophisticated empires on the planet, the Aztec Empire. A largely urbanized, technologically sophisticated people, civilization in Mexico, in Mesoamerica, numbering somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. 15 to 20 million people. And so the question is this: how does this band of 500 strangers, invaders, 500, conquer this very large, very sophisticated, very powerful economic, socially, culturally, and militarily empire? How does he do it, and in such a short period of time? Now, we should say a little bit about who the Aztecs were. Like, who are they? Cortes didn't know this, but we know this as historians. In the grand story of Mesoamerican and South American civilization, they're latecomers, right? There had been several other major, sophisticated, urban-dwelling civilizations in Mesoamerica and South America thousands of years before the rise of the Aztecs. I mean, going back to the earliest Olmec civilizations, builder of pyramids and great cities, as early as 1500 BC. The Aztecs, through most of this history, had been a peripheral people, a nomadic warrior people whose home regions appeared to be the northwestern areas of what would be modern-day Mexico. And in fact, they called themselves the Mexica, right? That's where we get the name Mexico, the land of the Mexica. And the Aztecs initially invade southern and central Mexico in a period of decline of another group of people called the Toltecs, who had, for reasons we don't really understand, abandoned some of their cities, seemed to have been in decline. And the Aztecs, initially this semi-nomadic warrior people, occupy some ancient cities and revive them, and go on to grow in strength. Somewhere around maybe 1100, 1200 AD, right, this begins to happen. Only a few hundred years before the arrival of the Spaniards. What's interesting in the Aztec story is we don't see this too often in history. We see semi-nomadic people invading or attacking or raiding settled urban people. In fact, that's a large part of global history. What we don't see so much is them settling and taking on the attributes of this urban culture. In fact, reviving it, and in many ways, improving it. The Aztecs have a capital. It's Tenochtitlan, right? Tenochtitlan, which had been a city before, but they revive it. And all contemporary accounts and archaeological evidence suggests that this may have been the greatest, largest, most sophisticated city on the planet at this point in time in 1519. It had 250,000 residents. It's truly a continentally attractive city as people travel from thousands of miles away to trade here, to engage in its markets. It had some 50,000 visitors a day. You know, this is an amazing thing. It had impressive waterworks. It had impressive architecture. You know, when the Europeans, when Cortes and his men first set foot in this city, they had never seen the like. You know, in terms of size and scale, it is 3 to 10 times larger than any other European city. I mean, the only other European city at this time that's even close is Naples, which is half the population of what we see in Tenochtitlan. So the Aztecs are kind of a fascinating people. You know, another thing we do know about them, of course, too, is they were warlike. And they were surprisingly and enticingly and remarkably bloodthirsty, right? And this is sort of ebbed and flowed. You've read about this in your books. You've heard about it other places, the idea of human sacrifice, these sort of blood cultural rites. And the history of these, or how we tell the history, you know, there was a time when that was just taken as the gospel truth. The Aztecs engaged in human sacrifice. It was one of the cornerstones of their civilization, of their culture, of their religion. Late 80s, early 90s, some historians started to write some apologies for this, downplaying it, saying that the Spanish exaggerated the size and the scope of human sacrifice. Recent historiography, archaeological evidence, textual evidence suggests that no, actually, the story of human sacrifice is quite true, and it is one of the shocking faces of Aztec culture. You know, blood right cultures go back a long way through many civilizations, the Incans, the Mayans, the Olmecs, in you know, South American, Latin American history in these civilizations. But the Aztecs take it to an exceptional height. You know, it is estimated, you know, at their height, some 10,000 people a year are sacrificed, right? And the way they would be sacrificed, and it's worth discussing this, is, you know, you could picture they had these big steep temples with you know, you could picture them with the steep staircases at the top, and they'd be stretched out across an altar while they were alive, facing up, while a priest would take an obsidian knife, and obsidian is a very hard stone. And this is an important point we'll come back to later. The Aztecs, in fact, all the Mesoamerican people, for all of their technological sophistication, did not have advanced metallurgy. They didn't have advanced alloy compounds and metals. Obsidian, which is a volcanic stone of incredible hardness, and plus you can chip it and make it sharp, was one of their you know, main hard tools. That's just an aside. Would carve open this guy's chest while he was alive, pull out his still beating heart, and hold it up and rip it out, and they would roll his body down these steps. That's why they were so steep to the people below. And they did this. These sacrifices were usually to one of two things. You know, there's two gods. There's a rain god and a war god, Tlaloc. One, they are engaged in a lot of war. They have a lot of warrior cults and culture. And so, obviously, there's lots of sacrifices or appeals made to a god who aids you in war. That's part of their ancient heritage. The other thing was probably a newer god for them to take on, but it was definitely important to all civilizations, and that's a rain god. You know, city-dwelling people rely on agriculture, and agriculture relies on water and rain, especially in southern Mexico. And you can imagine the pull and the power and the need or the desire to, you know, beckon to a god of rain and weather is very strong. And so sacrifices to this rain god and to this war god are very much at the heart of Aztec culture. But they also are very engaged in commerce. They had extended commercial contacts all throughout Mesoamerica and as far away as the Incans in the northern parts of South America, right? Their city is also a city of not just bloodthirsty priestly rites, although it is a large part of it. It's a city of manufacturing, of skilled craftsmen, of trade, of art, of advanced mathematics. It's a real paradox, the Aztecs, in a very extreme way, striking to the observers of the time. It's striking to observers throughout history. Another thing I would like to point out, just so we understand this Aztec empire, So we say it numbered somewhere between 15, 20 million. Some make it a little smaller, around 10 million. Sometimes it's hard to really recapture these numbers throughout the gaps of history. But we have to have this idea. Everyone in that 15 million, we'll average them out, wasn't an Aztec. In fact, most of them probably weren't Aztecs. Aztecs are the recent interloper conquering powers over many different urban dwelling and community dwelling Native American communities and ethnicities. In fact, recent ethnographers suggest there were as many as 500 distinct ethnic and language groups and communities existing under Aztec rule. And most of them not willingly, right? And this is kind of where the warlike culture comes in. The Aztecs invest a lot of time in subjugating and dominating these other people, right? They hold them in a somewhat unwilling empire, right? The Aztecs probably numbered in the hundreds of thousands, but their larger empire, of millions is many different people, not all of whom love the Aztecs. And since many of these people were the ones who are the sacrificial victims in these human sacrifice rites, and they would also act as conscripted labor from time to time to build these big, mighty public works in like Tenochtitlan, there's a deep, resentment towards the Aztec rulers, and only a little bit of destabilization to the ruling order would lead to revolution, would lead to them perhaps assisting people overthrowing the Aztecs. And that's an idea we're going to come back to. But I just wanted you to have a very clear idea, or at least a general idea of who the Aztecs are. One, so that we need to know a little bit about their culture to it's going to help us understand how Cortes pulls off this victory, this conquest that becomes a model for Spanish conquest and victory for the next 100 years, 200 years. But also because it does kind of also point out how impressive what Cortes achieves really was, right? They are a large, sophisticated, warlike people, right? They both have a warrior culture and a level of technological sophistication, and they are large in number, and they have the home field advantage in this contest. So, moving over to analyzing the Spanish, I want to go back a little bit because there are a couple of historical theories that are old theories about how Cortes pulled this off, and they've been largely discredited, and most modern historians have moved on, and yet the durability of some of these explanations is amazing. They still pop up in casual conversations on the internet, on Wikipedia. So I want to call them to your attention just to discuss them a little bit, and so you'll see how the explanation I'm going to put forth differs. So basically, there are 4 explanations from older historians that explained how Cortes and his band of 500 soldiers are able to defeat this large million-plus empire. And it goes something like this, that Cortes had the advantages of horses, gunpowder, and steel. And they add to that a 4th thing that I'm going to talk about, something that used to be referred to as the Black Legend. The Black Legend. So horses, gunpowder, steel, and this Black Legend. Cortes does have horses, gunpowder, and steel. And, in a battle, in a fight, yeah, those are all wonderful advantages, especially to have over people who had no horses. There had been indigenous horses in American prehistory. They were hunted to extinction by early Native Americans. They were different than the European and the Eurasian horses, but there were these large quadrupeds that don't exist. By the time Cortes gets there are no large animals that carry, warriors back and forth, right? They don't have horses. Horses are an advantage. But the Spanish didn't have that many horses, and they didn't fight on horseback. They were foot soldiers. Cortes rides a horse because he's a nobleman and he's the leader. Most of these guys were fighting on foot. And again, when you're facing millions, even if you had a horse for every man, it hardly begins to explain this sort of victory. Guns and steel, we'll take each separately. Steel is an advantage. The fact that they had armor that was harder than obsidian and was resistant to being pierced by the hardest substance the Aztecs had, that certainly makes a difference, right? But armor has to be maintained. And he's in the field. He's burnt his boats. He's alone for 3 years. Armor rusts out. It breaks. And again, it's still only 500 men. Now, gunpowder could have been a great advantage, but you have to kind of back this up a little bit and understand the nature of gunpowder and how it's used in war in 1519. You know, the gun, the handheld musket, and then later the rifle as an effective use in war wouldn't come into existence for another 100 years, right? Very few people die from getting shot by guns in battles in 1519. Most of the fighting is still with swords and arrows, right? Because until, this is an aside, but really until the 30 Years' War and Eugene of Savoy, a Dutch nobleman, really creates a new style of military discipline that works with using guns. Handheld guns are not a meaningful part of warfare, right? They don't really explain Cortes. Now, he does have some cannons, and cannons are incredibly effective in a siege. When you have a fixed enemy behind walls, you need to knock down those walls, pulverize their buildings on the inside, and he does use them, and they are effective. They are probably part of the story. But most of the battles he fights are on the open battlefield, moving all around Mesoamerica, modern Mexico. And at this point in time, cannons are hard to move. He doesn't have hundreds of them. He has some, right? And they're not as effective in an open melee. They don't really help explain how he eventually got to the point where he could put this capital city, Tenochtitlan, under siege. So while these certainly explain some military advantages this small group had, they can't remotely begin to explain this conquest, this achievement. And then there's this fourth thing called the Black Legend. And we're going to come back to this Black Legend. The Black Legend sort of says this. There was a belief that these Spanish conquerors were somehow more cruel, more dastardly, more willing to apply extreme methods of violence and torture and genocide and murder systematically, relentlessly than any other European group. That the Spanish have some sort of monopoly on coercive violence, dark coercive violence. And their ability to perpetrate that and continue it not only aided their conquest of the Aztecs, the Mexica, but it also aided them in their sort of conquest and domination and control of all of New Spain. We're going to come back to that. First of all, one of the ideas is, without a doubt, there's something in the Spanish culture, their war culture, that makes them highly effective against all native groups. But I'm going to argue it's something that's shared by all European invaders, right? They have a particular style of war, a culture of war. And we're going to think a little bit about war as a culture, not just as a strategy or a tactic. It's also a culture on what you do that the Spanish do use to great effect. Whether they were capable of being more brutal than the Aztecs, I think, is obviously untrue. The Aztecs could peel people's faces off and wear them as they sacrificed people, which actually happens by the tens of thousands. They could subjugate weaker, less martial people. That's certainly part of the Aztec worldview. It's part of the entire human worldview, especially in 1519. But there is something to, maybe not a black legend expressly applied to the Spaniards, but to a European culture of war that definitely plays large in this story. Okay, and we're going to come back to this. So, what's the big answer? There's several different causes, several different things that aid Cortes. I'm going to give you the number one, and we're going to look at it at two levels. And I'm going to tell you this ahead of time. No matter what the question is, if it's about contact between European peoples and a native isolated people, and I mean that geographically isolated, all these points of contest and conquest and settlement, the answer is always disease. That is the most significant historical event, social event, cultural event, psychological event, mortal event that comes out of every moment of contact. As Europeans, and it's not just true for the North American and South American New Worlds, it's true in Australia, it's true throughout all of Polynesia, right? All of these places, disease plays this incredible role. These sort of unforeseen consequences of bringing old world microbes and bacteria that had grown in one population across an ocean to people who had developed their biological immunities and resistances in isolation for some 20,000 years when the last great ice age recedes and the Bering Straits get swallowed up by the ocean again, right? They get cut off. And they don't just get cut off culturally, socially, technologically, but biologically. And you know this, you've read this in your textbook. This is well-trodden ground, that disease has a huge impact. And in the Aztec story, maybe this is the biggest part of the story. Maybe this is all we need to know, although I think there is more. But here are the facts. Cortes shows up in 1619. He kind of plunders his way. He gets invited into Tenochtitlan. He meets Moctezuma, the emperor. He has a falling out. He gets driven out of the city. He'll return a few years later to discover close to 70% of the city was already dead, had died of disease. And this story is true all throughout Mesoamerica and much of the northern parts of South America among the Incans. Disease, particularly smallpox is the big one, but there's others, chickenpox and other unnamed diseases, tears through this native population. And in Mesoamerica, where much of the population is urbanized or lived in large towns, the effects of disease is far greater. You know, as an aside, the effects of disease as a percentage of population in North America, especially like the Great Plains Indians, is far lower. They're more spread out, right? You don't have these high concentrations of people living together, all drinking from one water source, right? In urbanized Mesoamerica, the numbers are catastrophic. As a whole, within a 4-year period, right, the population of Mesoamerica drops by 60%. 60%. Comparison, the worst of the Black Death in Europe, the death rate is maybe 33%. Maybe, right? They're not sure about that number. So we're talking more than double that. A true human cataclysm. And to really understand what this means, I'm going to ask you to kind of step out of a cold, calculating, statistical view, because sometimes statistics have the unfortunate effect of yanking the humanity out of a story. And there's nothing wrong with being empathetic in an intellectual analysis. And I want you to think about this. Think of the 10 people in this world you care about the most, who are closest to you, who mean something to you. Now have 6 of them die fast, within 2 or 3 months, and die this horrible death where their skin blisters, they have these fevers, they have emitting all kinds of foul things from their body, and there's nothing your science, your faith, your culture, your prayers, your medicine can do about it. They just die. And now add something else. Let's make this happen during a time of extreme crisis, natural calamity, a major invasion where your culture really is and your society really is on the verge of being overthrown. Aside from the very obvious mortal cost in terms of manpower and warriors available, right, to take on this invading Spanish threat, which is obviously a very practical and real part of disease, there's a psychological and a cultural aspect of being overwhelmed by disease. And here's why. Because in a time of crisis, particularly a siege, and think about what a siege is. You're in a city, there's enemies outside, and you have this sort of slow grinding warfare, and what you really need to do is survive. You need to last longer than they do, right? You need, and that takes more than military effort, it takes cultural cohesion, faith in your traditions, faith in your medicines and your science, belief in who you are as a people. You can't despair. Despair is the enemy of success when crisis is what's facing your civilization. And this is true for any humans, us now, the Aztecs in the past. This overwhelming apocalypse of European diseases, this rapid death whose numbers outstrip any Holocaust, any genocide, overwhelms them, right? It really does break down all of the stability of the Aztec Empire. It breaks down much of their will to resist, right? In terms of true manpower, in terms of the fact they had to deal with all this disease, but also this sort of psychological and cultural breakdown, right? And I think we can understand this, you know, by I don't want to say we should personalize it, we should empathize it and allow that to inform our analysis, and you could really understand why this is more than just, well, we didn't have as many guys as we had before to fight. Because statistically, you know, 40% of 20 million is still, I want to say 8 million, right? So they still grossly outnumber, right, the Spanish invaders, but there's more to it than that. That this wave of European disease and microbes, this sort of unintended apocalypse, was not just a mortal and biological calamity, but it was a cultural and psychological calamity as well, and one that largely overwhelmed them and other Native American groups as well. Other Native American groups who were probably more than able to initially resist European incursion are undone by disease. And it spreads faster than the Europeans. One of the emperors of the Incans down in South America will die of smallpox 10 years, right, before a Spaniard gets to Peru, right? That's how fast these diseases can move through this very mobile, urban, trading population, right? So we cannot undo the power of disease in this story, in any of these contact stories. So that's number one. Number two, we say, here's a question. We say, well, how do you do it with only 500 guys? Well, it's only if we stick with the original sources and how the story was told for a long time from a European point of view that he only has 500 guys. If you recall what I said earlier, the Aztecs aren't 20 million people. They're a smaller group of people who rule over 20 million people, of 500 distinct ethnic groups and language groups, many of whom very much resent Aztec rule. And in this sort of crisis of Spanish invasion and of disease, the ruling order is incredibly destabilized. And many of these native groups will actually throw in and join Cortes. Cortes is often celebrated as a warrior, but you know what he was actually most successful as? A diplomat. He does some amazing things. One of the first things he does is he gets married. He marries a Native American princess who's from a Mayan group, they believe, named Malinche. She becomes celebrated later in Mexican culture as Dona Marina, sort of the mother of Mexico and Mexican identity. And he marries her and gains the loyalty of her particular group, and she acts as an interpreter. And he travels around, and one of the things he does, he knows he can't win with 500 guys, but he also knows that the Aztecs are unpopular, and he raises armies, particularly among a group, I'm going to write their names down, and they're called the Tlaxcalan. This was an unconquered group of people who were semi-subjugated, large group of people living near the Aztec. And at first they're the enemies of Cortes, but eventually through diplomacy, he wins them over. And in fact, they supply close to 40,000 warriors towards his effort of attacking and killing the Aztecs, right? Defeating the Aztecs. Cortes have tens of thousands of allies. And so part of the second answer to this question is, how does Cortes do it? It's not just guns, steels, and horses. It's also this 40, maybe 50,000 Indian allies, Native American allies, who throw in with his conquest and his siege and his, of Tenochtitlan and the conquest of the Aztecs. It's a big part of the story. Of course, that's written out of the earliest accounts as the Europeans write this themselves, but it's been largely recovered, and we know this to be true. The third piece of the puzzle, and this is also an important one, and I guess it kind of comes back to the Black legend. The Aztecs and the Europeans have very different styles and culture of war. Styles and culture of war. The two types of war, there's a type of war that's been identified and put into a historical discussion by a great military historian, John Keegan, well-known and popular military historian, John Keegan. And he came up with this idea of total war, which he says largely is the culture of war employed by the Europeans. And remember, war isn't just strategy, but it also reflects the culture and the civilization and the society of the people who wage the war. The sort of things you might or might not do in a war, or the goals you might or might not have in a war, reflect culture and identity more than they reflect strategy, or at least as much. Versus, and here's the other side of it, something the Aztecs called, and it's a wonderful name, the flower war. A flower war. That hardly sounds like a war at all. The Flower War. So what is the Aztec Flower War? Let's take that first. Aztec war like this. It had a very specific function. You know, for the Aztecs, yeah, they conquered these people, but they don't annihilate the people. They're not interested in burning their towns down and destroying these cities, right? The Aztecs, as much as they want human sacrifice, you know what they want even more? Commerce, wealth, trade, technology, art, learning, right? And you can't, the way you get all that is by having large urbanized civilization that is able to work together, that has, you know, a labor force and a creative force in all these different areas that can make different things and exchange them. And if you completely annihilate your enemies, well, you don't have that at all. You just have a lot of dead enemies. And so the Aztec war has a very specific set of functions. You know, one of the first set of functions is sort of this display, in almost like an animal sense of display of dominance, particularly political dominance. And what they would often do is they had frequent wars. They would frequently declare war on other communities and other cities or other towns, and they would announce it. They would say, on such and such a day, we are coming to make war, be ready. And they had a large professional warrior class that this was their job. And on the day of the war, they would show up. And it must have been an incredible sight to see. You know, the Aztec warriors, they had these very specific war cults, each with their own identity. Some wore the skins and the bright costumes of jaguars. Others dressed up like eagles and incredibly bright plumage with large colored shields and these large obsidian spears. They would expect you to put together an army and send them out into the field. And before the battle would begin, the soldiers, the Aztec warriors, would go through a series of ritual boasts and dances and songs and prayers and chants, and all of this ceremony kind of revving themselves up. And then finally, at a particular moment, the battle would ensue. And the battle would be relatively quick. They weren't interested in long, multi-day battles. These were quick, fast melees. Two sides would fight, and you try to kill people, but eventually, the way the battle would happen is one side would basically turn around and run, would retreat from the field. And whenever this happened, and I should say, for a multi-hundred-year period, that side that ran was never the Aztecs, right? They would win these battles. They would throw down their weapons, swear to you, throw down their weapons, run after the captives, and grab them and capture them and tie them up. And then they would bring these captives back to the capital cities for human sacrifice, right, to the gods of rain and war. And the other function this served, they didn't take all the people. And so the warrior classes kind of were very important. And a warrior's honor and ability to move up and have status depended not on the number of people he killed, but the number of captives he grabbed. This was their identity, that we have this great, proud, martial display of dominance and ceremony and celebration of who they are as warriors. They have this quick battle that tests your mettle, tests your bravery, tests your fighting skills, and then you grab the spoils of war. And the spoils of war are human beings brought back for captive. But they didn't kill most of the people. They didn't even take most of the people, right? Yes, at its height, 10,000 people a year are being sacrificed to Aztec gods. That's pretty extreme. But what we do know, what we can really say about these Aztec wars, compared to European wars, particularly in the 15th and the 16th and 17th century, really compared to European wars, is that Aztec warfare, this is true for many Native American groups, was very frequent, but not very deadly. Very frequent, not very deadly. They had pretty low body counts. The end of the day, you know what happened at the battle? You took the captives, but the villages weren't destroyed, or the towns you fought were not decimated as a people. In fact, they would continue. They would once again swear allegiance to, the Aztecs and, give them tribute, which is what the Aztecs really wanted as well. And they displayed this dominance over them, but you didn't destroy the town. They weren't permanently annihilated. It wasn't a genocide, right? And this is very much at the heart of Aztec culture. It's very functional. It's about political dominance, about gaining captives. It has this religious ceremonial factor, even if it is a dark religious ceremonial factor. And it has a social factor. It's about warrior honor and status within their own society and how they're valued. And these very powerful Aztec warrior cults. And what we also know about the Aztecs is they had no appetite for sustained battle. They had really no appetite for a war of attrition, right? Slow, grinding, multi-day, multi-month, multi-generational warfare. They wanted none of that. It made no sense to them. It seemed cowardly and odd. They said, hey, if we're having a war, we should fight. Get it over, right? This is like the Jets and the Sharks. Let's settle it with one big rumble. And, you know, what they really didn't have is this idea of siege warfare. You know, in Europe, much warfare is done through siege. Basically, one side is trying to hold out in a city or behind embankments or in a fortress, while the other one slowly moves in and starves them out, pounds them out, wears them out. And of course, siege warfare is what they were going to face ultimately when they faced the Europeans. So let's talk a little bit about total war. So what is this total war? Well, total war, you know, the European style of war and the goal of wars, especially once we start hitting into the 16th century, then the late 15th century that we come out of, is one of a much more extreme and expansive form of warfare, in which you not only engaged and defeated someone on a battlefield, but if they ran from you, you followed them to the village and you burnt it down. You set their fields on fire and destroyed their food sources for the winter so they would still starve, right? You completely annihilated your enemy. You made it so they could not resist you, or you just drove them out completely. It's incredibly destructive that when the Europeans achieved this, you know, the ultimate sign of victory in a European war is they sack your city, right? Cities get sacked. Rome gets sacked and burned. Cities get sacked. That is the history of European war. And it's a patient style of warfare. They're willing to sit in trenches and wait for days and days and days and months and years and starve you out until you finally capitulate, and then they overrun you and they destroy your food sources, right? And the idea was you didn't just beat someone martially, you crushed them psychologically. That long after the pain of loss on the battle had been felt, you were still feeling the deprivation of having stood up to this other power, because you were starving through the winter. You were lamenting your lost sons and daughters who had died, your cities and towns that had been burnt. And this is an extreme form of warfare. And it is very much the kind of warfare Cortes will engage in against the Aztecs. And unsurprising, you know, Cortes comes out of a culture, this Spanish culture, had recently, in the 1480s and into the 1490s, just finished fighting something called the Reconquista, the reconquest. And if you'll recall, the southern half of Spain, for about a 700-year period, had been dominated and controlled by Muslim powers, right, from North Africa, for a good 700 years. And you know, Spain as a country, as a concept, had really only come into existence in this Reconquista, which is seen as a holy war as northern Catholic Christian Spain conquers and drives out in an almost extreme, total war style, almost genocidal driving out of southern Muslims and Jews, right? And by doing this, you know, they unite Aragon and Castile, and Spain becomes this very martial, very fervently religious and aggressive European nation state, right? And this is the mindset, this is the sort of warrior like Cortes that's importing this martial style, this total war style ramped up with religious fervor and recent victories to the New World. And the way this plays out in the war between Cortes and the Aztecs is this, is that, you know, the Aztecs had a lot of trouble dealing with the fact that Cortes would hide. He'd do ambushes, right? He would burn cities, destroy food sources. They were shocked by this. They said, what kind of war is this? They saw how the Europeans fought as cowardly, whereas in the European accounts, they saw the way the Aztecs fought as foolish, as childish, like you guys don't know how to make a war. You know, one of the enduring cultural tricks that Cortes plays again and again and again, and really it's shocking how often it works, but it shows you how embedded a culture of war can be, is one trick that the Aztecs fell for again and again was this, is Cortes would basically, you know, hide warriors on the flanks of a battlefield, right? And of course, he'd put his men, one group up front, and he would engage a very large group of Aztecs, and often their numbers were far larger. And he'd figured this out because he is a diplomat, because he did understand who he was fighting, one of the Aztecs' fatal weaknesses. And so what he would do is he would quickly engage the Aztecs, right, which you know they like. They like quick battle. They're like, quick battle, that we understand. And then he would give the signal for a rapid retreat. And of course, they would rapidly retreat. And the Aztecs, time and again, because this had been a warrior culture, you know, probably thousands of years old, but certainly this case in terms of this civilization, hundreds of years old, they've been trained to this. It's hard to break the training you have as a warrior culture. Chase them, would throw down their weapons and say, oh, we've won the battle, it's time to grab the captives. And sure enough, they would run into this pincer-like movement where they would just get cut to ribbons. I mean, this is the classic, flanking and surrounding. And it happens again and again and again. This is this contest of war. And for Cortes, he doesn't care about whether it seems, tricky or dishonest or deceitful or lacking in honor, right? It's about winning. Total war is about annihilating your enemy using whatever you can and whatever weakness they have to pull it off. And as a matter of fact, when people looked at this at the time, they celebrated Cortes for his cleverness. Like, he was known as the clever conquistador, right? And where this also really plays out again is in the final siege. So eventually, 1521 into 1522, Cortes is surrounded Tenochtitlan, the once great city of the Aztecs. And of course, their numbers have been decimated, and their morale has been decimated by disease by this point in time, by constant losses on the battlefield, and we have this last chance to hold out. And of course, they fail, right? They're just too broken as a people, and as I said, they don't really have a cultural war mindset to even fight this siege war. They constantly try to entreat Cortes to meet them in some sort of battle to settle this, and of course, he's not going to do it. And eventually, Cortes enters a defeated and broken city, right, which they loot and plunder. And actually, he is actually shocked because he had been there only once before, in which it was this amazing city, which he writes about being impressed with it. He comes back and he finds a city that's a horrific graveyard full of rotting bodies that have died from disease and starvation and despair. A proud people reduced to a broken people. And this leaves a bit of an impression on Cortes. He does remark on this. But these sort of competing cultures of war, this total war versus the flower war, this is also a big part of the story, right? Disease, just so we can sort of recap this whole argument. The big factors in how Cortes pulls this off is disease, which had both a very practical, mortal consequence, as 60% of Mesoamericans die from a disease, and of course a psychological, cultural one that made them unable or really hampered their ability to, as a people, culturally and psychologically resist the crisis of Spanish invasion, right? And we can really understand that. The Native American allies, the Tlaxcalan, that's a huge part of the story. Tens and thousands of warriors, because even this maneuver here, you know what? It wouldn't have worked if Cortes only had 500 guys. Right? He needed all these other soldiers. He was able to train them into this style of fighting. But for the Aztecs, right, they could never really adapt to that. But the Indian allies, the Native American allies, they're very important. And finally, this sort of competitive cultures of war. Total war versus the flower war, right? And, again and again, this story would play out. And maybe this is where the black legend has some meaning, right? That the Europeans, in this case the Spanish, really are brutal, right? They don't commit the original genocide everyone thought, where they killed millions of people. Disease did that. But they kill an awful lot of people. They have no problem killing civilians, destroying buildings, destroying great waterworks, destroying food supplies to really break the will of people, and killing as many people as possible, giving no quarter on the battlefield, unless you were known to be a prisoner of value, some sort of high-ranking noble. There was no quarter on the battlefield. And that is notable. That is dark. That is an extreme sort of black legend style of warfare. What I want to caution you against is thinking this is a Spanish thing. This is a European thing. This is the same story that plays out. This total war is employed as the English conquer and settle their New World empire. It'll be played out again as the American colonists spread throughout their New World empire. It'll be played out again to almost the end of the 19th century as the United States government expands and consolidates the American West against the Native American people who live there. Total war, this very style of total war. Mass violence, starvation, humiliation, breaking the will as well as breaking their bodies. This is still part of that style of war. And they don't only just use it against Native Americans, I should say. It's employed in the 30 Years' War. It's employed in World War I and World War II. It's employed in Sherman's march to the sea during the Civil War. I mean, these are all forms of total war. This is kind of a grand European style, but it's employed to maybe, it's certainly percentage-wise, a shockingly devastating effect against native peoples. The final thing I want to talk about as we reflect back on all this is to look at Cortes's success and his failure, and think about how this reflects on Spanish success and failure in the New World. You know, on the one hand, Cortes is a success, right? He set out this very clear goal that he achieves. And you have to realize this, for the first 20 years, 1492 to this point to 1519, the Spanish hadn't found anything. They'd settled a few islands, they had wandered around, they'd found no gold, they had found no large civilization, they had found nothing profitable, right? The New World venture really wasn't a very profitable or engaging or interesting venture. It's Cortes who makes it that way. Cortes is the first conquistador who kind of sets up this model. Find this really large, urbanized, powerful Native American, Mesoamerican people, conquer them, wipe them out, and plunder their treasure, right? Plunder it, and keep a lot of that plunder for yourself, send it back to enrich the crown. And that's exactly what he does. And in fact, it'll be repeated again when Francisco Pizarro does the same thing 10 years later in Peru against the Incas. And he also gets the most valuable silver mine in human history, the Potosi silver mine. So there's some sustainable wealth that comes out of this as well. But that's the success of the Spaniards. But there's also a failure. You know, what we know about the Spaniards is this, is that the Spanish Empire made Spain very powerful and wealthy for a very short period of time, right? As long as they could take this New World plunder, and that's all it was plunder, and extreme mining extractive wealth, right? The Aztecs did have gold and silver. They did have jewels. They did have things of value to send back, right? And as I said, they did eventually find mines that produced this stuff. But that eventually runs out. And the day that runs out, turns out the Spanish had no lasting wealth in the New World. They quickly go from world power to backwater power, declining power. Their ex-colonies become poor. They don't grow. They don't match the pace of development economically of the northern, right, European economies, colonial economies. You know what Cortes really lost? The very thing that the Aztecs knew was the real wealth that you were fighting for anyway, Tenochtitlan. Think about this. He could have taken control of this incredibly large, dynamic, productive city, made it pay tribute, made it a trade center, taken advantage of its manufacturing and its skilled craftsmen, taken over the old Aztec Empire, kept that trade alive. That's the sustainable wealth. That was the wealth that had made Mesoamerican and South American civilizations wealthy and large and sophisticated for 2,000 years. Cortes is really just a pirate. He plunders and destroys and then ends up with, yeah, treasure, but not the real treasure. Not the treasure that would have created lasting wealth, even from a very selfish colonial standpoint, lasting wealth, taking the horrible human cost out of it, or setting it aside anyway. Just looking at it as success. In this very moment, we do see the model of success that the Spanish will follow, conquest and plunder. We also see the failure that ultimately was the writing on the wall, right? The inability to develop sustainable, lasting commerce and cultural social wealth in these New World colonies. Thank you.